Most wrestlers say they are going to retire and never do. They come back for one more match, one more run, one more paycheck. It is practically a tradition in professional wrestling. The retirement that never sticks. But Jimmy Garvin did something almost nobody in this business ever does. He walked away from professional wrestling, stayed retired, and became a commercial airline pilot. And unlike so many of his peers who burned bright and flamed out tragically, Garvin built a quiet, stable life after the ring. His story does not end in heartbreak. It ends at 30,000 feet. But before he found peace in the cockpit, Jimmy Garvin lived one of the wildest, most entertaining careers of the 1980s. He feuded with Ric Flair over the honor of his wife. He brawled with Kevin Sullivan in a triple-stacked cage. He was the fourth Freebird before anyone even called him that officially. And he did it all with a look, a strut, and a level of charisma that made people either want to punch him in the face or shake his hand, depending on the year. What makes Garvin's story so fascinating is that he was never supposed to be the main event guy. He was not built like a Ric Flair or a Dusty Rhodes. He did not have the family legacy of a Von Erich, but what he had was an uncanny ability to make people care. Garvin understood the emotional core of professional wrestling in a way that plenty of bigger, more athletically gifted wrestlers never did. He could make you hate him on a Monday and cry for him on a Saturday. This is the story of gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. James Williams was born on September the 25th, 1952, in Tampa, Florida. He grew up in a wrestling household, though not in the way you might expect. His stepfather was a man named Roger Barnes, better known to wrestling fans as Rugged Ronnie Garvin. The man who would become his kayfabe brother was actually his stepfather in real life. Wrestling has always been a strange business, but the Garvin family tree might be one of its most tangled branches. Growing up in Tampa, young James was drawn to amateur wrestling. He competed in school and showed natural athleticism, but the professional side of the business called to him early, really early. At just 16 years old, in November of 1968, James Williams made his professional wrestling debut under the name Bo James. He was still a teenager. Most kids that age were worrying about homework and high school dances. Jimmy was taking bumps in front of live crowds. He quickly adopted a new ring name, Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, and was given two kayfabe brothers in the business, Terry Garvin and Ron Garvin. Jimmy briefly managed both of them, which is a wild detail considering Ron was actually his stepfather in real life. The brothers mainly worked for NWA Mid-America until they split up in 1975. After the breakup, Jimmy ventured out on his own, making his debut in the Florida territory in 1976. For the next several years, Garvin bounced around the Southern Territories. He worked Florida Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. These were the proving grounds of professional wrestling in the late 70s and early 80s. Every territory had its own booker, its own style, its own hierarchy, and if you wanted to survive, you had to adapt fast. Garvin learned how to work a crowd in smoky National Guard armories and muggy civic centers across the Deep South. He tagged with Steve Keirn and Jack Brisco in Florida, winning tag team championships along the way. He even teamed with the notorious Killer Carl Cox for a run with the NWA United States tag team titles. These were not glamorous, nationally televised events. This was the grind. This was where you either figured out how to get people emotionally invested in what you were doing, or you went home and found a real job. Garvin figured it out. He was not the biggest guy in the locker room. He was not the most technically gifted wrestler on the card. But he had something that could not be taught. He had charisma. He understood how to make people react, whether that meant making them furious or making them cheer. And he had a look. Even early in his career, There was something about the way Jimmy carried himself that drew attention. The bleached blonde hair, the cocky smile, the way he moved like he believed he was the most important person in any room he walked into. That kind of confidence is either genuine or it is an incredible act. And in wrestling, it does not matter which one it is, as long as the crowd buys it. It was during his time in Florida that something important happened. In 1982, while holding the NWA Florida Global Tag Team Championship alongside Big John Studd, Garvin won the NWA Southern Heavyweight Championship from Sweet Brown Sugar. His manager at the time, J.J. Dillon, rewarded him with a valet named Precious. Now this was not the Precious that fans would come to know later. The original Precious was a different woman entirely. But the concept, the idea of Jimmy Garvin as this vain, self-obsessed pretty boy who was constantly distracted by the beautiful woman at ringside, that was born right here. And that gimmick would define his career. There was just one problem. The on-screen flirtatious relationship with his valet was causing real problems in his actual marriage. Garvin was married to Patty Williams, and having her husband play lovey-dovey with another woman on television every week was creating tension at home. Something had to change. Garvin later admitted in a shoot interview that the on-screen dynamic with the original Precious had been a genuine source of conflict in his marriage. He needed to find a way to keep the gimmick alive without destroying his home life. The solution was clever. In the spring of 1983, Jimmy Garvin made one of the most important moves of his career. He joined World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas, Texas, and he brought along a new valet. This time it was his real-life cousin, Valerie French, who took on the name Sunshine. Garvin replaced the original Precious with a family member, which solved his marriage problems. For now, Garvin arrived in World Class as a heel, and he immediately made an impact. He wore white cloth gloves, sparkling bow ties, and boot covers that Sunshine would carefully remove before each match. He refused to wrestle on live television, and he carried himself like he was too good for every arena he walked into. The fans absolutely despised him, which meant he was doing his job perfectly. Sunshine was not your typical wrestling valet. Unlike the submissive roles women traditionally played in the business at that time, Sunshine was portrayed as a strong-willed, fiercely loyal presence who was not afraid to get physically involved. She would distract opponents, crack them over the head with a loaded purse, and even spray them in the eyes with an aerosol canister. She was not just eye candy, she was a weapon, and Garvin knew how to use her. His first major feud was with the most beloved babyface in World Class, David Von Erich. The two battled over the Texas Heavyweight Championship throughout the first half of 1983, and the chemistry was electric. These two could not have been more different. David was the rugged, all-American hero from the legendary Von Erich family. Garvin was the preening, arrogant outsider hiding behind his valet. The most memorable moment from their rivalry came when David beat Garvin in a match with a special stipulation. The loser had to serve as the winner's personal servant for an entire day. So there was Jimmy Garvin, this man who thought he was better than everyone, out on David Von Erich's ranch washing dogs, hauling hay bales by hand, and generally being humiliated while David relaxed and shot skeet over Jimmy and Sunshine's heads. It was incredible television. But Garvin drew the line when David told him to clean out the old horse barn, and the two went at it right there on the ranch. Moments like that are why World Class was must-see television. But then the landscape shifted. Garvin brought in his real wife Patty and introduced her as Sunshine too, presenting her as an assistant to the original Sunshine. The plan was for them to coexist, but that was never going to last. After Sunshine 2's interference cost Garvin the WCCW Television Championship against Johnny Mantell in October 1983, Garvin blamed the original Sunshine, fired her on the spot, and renamed his wife as Precious. This set off one of the greatest feuds in world-class history, and it was not just between the men. Sunshine, scorned and furious, aligned herself with Chris Adams. Now it was Garvin and Precious against Adams and Sunshine, and the fans were absolutely losing their minds. The couples competed in mixed tag team matches. Garvin and Adams traded the NWA American Heavyweight Championship back and forth. The women were just as involved as the men, scratching and clawing and adding layers of drama that the Dallas crowds ate up. When Sunshine temporarily left World Class in 1984 with the storyline that Garvin and Precious had injured her, the promotion brought in her truck-driving aunt, Stella Mae French, played by veteran wrestler Tanya West. Adams and Stella Mae kept the war going against Garvin and Precious until the big blow-off, a loser leaves town steel cage match in July 1984. Adams and Stella Mae won, and just like that, Garvin and Precious were gone from World Class. But Jimmy had been doing something else during his time in Dallas that would shape the rest of his career. He had been teaming with the Fabulous Freebirds, working alongside Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts during the height of their legendary war with the Von Erichs. Garvin became a close ally of the group. He was not officially a Freebird yet. That would come later. But the seeds were planted in World Class, and they would grow into something much bigger down the road. After leaving World Class, Garvin and Precious landed in the Minneapolis-based AWA in October 1984. The AWA was still a major promotion at this point, run by the legendary Vern, and it was home to some of the biggest names in the business. Garvin immediately positioned himself as a top contender, and the gorgeous Jimmy character fit perfectly in the AWA's old-school environment. From late 1984 through mid-1985, he repeatedly challenged AWA World Heavyweight Champion Rick Martel, coming up short each time, but proving he belonged in the main event picture. The matches with Martel were solid, competitive bouts that showed Garvin could hang with a world champion when given the opportunity. At Super Clash in September 1985, Garvin got a shot at Kerry Von Erich for the NWA Texas Heavyweight Championship in a cross-promotional match, but came up empty again. However, that same month brought him his biggest title win yet. Garvin teamed with Mr. Electricity Steve Regal, and with the help of the Fabulous Freebirds, they defeated the Road Warriors for the AWA World Tag Team Championship. Let that sink in for a moment. The Road Warriors, the most dominant and intimidating tag team on the planet, dropped the belts to Garvin and Regal. It took the Freebirds interfering to make it happen, but the result stood. They held those titles until January 1986, when they lost to Curt Hennig and Scott Hall in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Garvin's final match for the American Wrestling Association came at Wrestle Rock 86 in April 1986, teaming with Michael Hayes in a losing effort against the Road Warriors inside a steel cage. It was a fitting farewell to the territory, and now it was time for Garvin to head south to the big leagues. He arrived in Jim Crockett Promotions in mid-1986, and he came in hot as a heel. His first target was the legendary Wahoo McDaniel. Garvin would taunt the proud Native American warrior, mockingly calling him Yahoo, and the two battled throughout the summer and fall of 1986 in a series of brutal Indian strap matches. Garvin also feuded with the talented Brad Armstrong, and he was building toward a potentially huge program with Magnum TA when tragedy struck. Magnum was involved in a devastating car accident that ended his career. It was a reminder that in professional wrestling, the best laid plans can be destroyed in an instant. Then came the year 1987, the turning point that transformed Jimmy Garvin from a solid mid-card heel into one of the most compelling babyfaces in the NWA. And it all started with fire. His stepfather Ron Garvin was embroiled in a heated feud with Jim Cornette and his Midnight Express, the team of Bobby Eaton and the newly added Stan Lane. Cornette was one of the greatest managers and talkers in wrestling history, and his Midnight Express were an elite tag team. Ron Garvin had been battling them for weeks, and the intensity was building towards something ugly. Then during a televised match, Cornette threw fire in Ron's face. It was a vicious, cowardly attack that left Ron writhing on the ground. Several babyfaces rushed out to help, and then Jimmy came sprinting from the back. He helped carry Ron toward the medical area, making sure his stepfather was being taken care of. His friend and tag partner Barry Windham helped take Ron to the hospital. But then something snapped inside Jimmy. With Ron on his way to get medical attention, Jimmy flew into a blind rage. He stormed into the heel locker room and brutally attacked Cornette. The beating was so savage that it took multiple wrestlers, heels and babyfaces alike to pull him off. In that one electric moment, Jimmy Garvin became a good guy. There was no gradual turn, no weeks of teasing. It was instantaneous. The fans saw a man defending his family, and they were completely behind him from that second forward. Jimmy and Ron teamed up as the Garvin brothers, feuding with the Midnight Express in a program that produced some outstanding tag team matches. They even competed in the 1987 Jim Crockett Memorial Cup Tag Team Tournament, though they lost to the Express by countout. But the feud that truly defined Jimmy Garvin's career was just getting started. Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, set his sights on Precious. Flair started sending her gifts, making suggestive comments, and generally acting like the arrogant, womanizing champion he was. Jimmy was furious. Here was the most powerful man in professional wrestling openly pursuing his wife, and there was nothing he could do about it except fight. The build-up was masterful. Week after week, Flair would escalate his pursuit of Precious while Jimmy seethed. It all led to a massive steel cage match during the 1987 Great American Bash Tour, held at the Greensboro Coliseum in North Carolina. Flair's NWA World Heavyweight Championship was on the line, but there was an added stipulation that made the stakes feel almost unbearable. If Flair won, he would get a date with Precious. The match was an absolute war. After some headfirst trips into the steel fencing, Flair was a bloody mess and tried escaping the cage multiple times. But in Jim Crockett Promotions, you could not win by escaping. It was pinfall or submission only. At one point, Garvin pulled Flair down by his trunks, exposing the champion's bare backside to the roaring crowd. Garvin was giving everything he had, fighting not just for a world title, but for his wife's honor. Then disaster struck. Garvin attempted a leapfrog and landed awkwardly on one knee instead of his feet. The pain was immediate and visible, and he sold it for the rest of the match. The crowd could feel the tide turning. The emotion in that arena was so intense that a fan actually tried to climb into the cage to help Garvin. David Crockett, who was calling the match alongside Tony Schiavone, had to physically stop the fan before he got inside. But the knee was too damaged. Flair locked in the figure 4 leg lock, targeting that injured knee, and the pain was too much. Garvin blacked out, his shoulders hit the mat, and referee Tommy Young counted 3. Flair had won, and now he had his date with Precious. Ron Garvin stormed the cage after the match, attacking Flair to protect Jimmy from further damage. As Jimmy came to, his cries of pain and anguish echoed through the Greensboro Coliseum, mixing with the sounds of fans openly weeping in the crowd. It was one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in NWA history. But the Garvins got the last laugh. When the date with Precious finally occurred, Flair and his manager, J.J. Dillon, showed up expecting a night with a beautiful woman. Instead, they got punched out by Ron Garvin, who showed up dressed as Miss Atlanta Lively. Just 2 months later, Ron would unseat Flair as NWA World Champion, holding the title until Starrcade 1987, when Flair won it back. The entire saga, from the fireball to the cage match to the world title change, remains one of the greatest long-form stories in wrestling history. In 1988, Garvin found himself tangled up with Kevin Sullivan and his Varsity Club. And once again, it was all about Precious. Sullivan was one of the most psychologically manipulative characters in wrestling, and his obsession with Precious was genuinely unsettling. He stalked her, taunted her by calling her Patty instead of Precious, and waved mysterious papers from inside his robe as if he knew something about her past that nobody else did. The angle was eerie and creepy in a way that felt ahead of its time, and while it never fully paid off with a satisfying explanation of what those papers contained, it produced some excellent matches and kept the audience guessing. Jimmy challenged Varsity Club member Mike Rotunda for the NWA World Television Championship at Clash of the Champions 1 in March of 1988, coming up short in a hard-fought contest. But the biggest spectacle of the feud was still to come. The most notable match was the Tower of Doom at the Great American Bash in 1988 in Baltimore. 3 cages were stacked on top of each other, 5 men on each team, with Garvin and Sullivan serving as captains. A member from each team would start by climbing a ladder and facing off in the top cage, and every few minutes, new members from each side would enter. Every so often, the doors between cages would open for 10 seconds, allowing wrestlers to slip through to the next level. Precious held the key to the door of the bottom cage, and during the chaos, Sullivan managed to lock himself inside with her before Road Warrior Hawk made the save. Garvin's team included Ron Garvin, Dr. Death Steve Williams, and the Road Warriors. They were victorious, but the war was not over yet. In September of 1988, Sullivan and Mike Rotunda took Garvin out with one of the most brutal angles of the era. On the September 3rd edition of NWA World Championship Wrestling, filmed at the TBS studios, Sullivan smashed cement blocks over Jimmy's leg. Jim Ross, commentating at the time, screamed out a reaction so visceral it became legendary in its own right. Garvin sold the broken leg by disappearing from television entirely, and when he finally returned months later, the landscape had completely changed. When Jimmy Garvin came back to Jim Crockett Promotions, now rebranded as World Championship Wrestling, in June 1989, he was a different man. Precious was gone from his side. The romantic melodramas were over, and Jimmy had officially become what everyone had known for years. He was a freebird. At Clash of the Champions 7, on June 14, 1989, Garvin made his grand return as the newest member of the Fabulous Freebirds. That night, he and Michael Hayes won a tournament to claim the vacant NWA World Tag Team Championships. They beat the Dynamic Dudes in the semi-finals and the Midnight Express in the finals, Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane falling to the Freebirds in what felt like a triumphant arrival. Hayes and Garvin were officially a team, and they had gold around their waists on night 1. The thing about Garvin joining the Freebirds is that it was never really a surprise to anyone paying attention. He had been running with the group since his world-class days in 1983. He teamed with them, fought alongside them in their war against the Von Erichs, and shared their outlaw sensibility. He was always considered the 4th Freebird. Making it official just confirmed what everyone already knew. Hayes and Garvin had natural chemistry as a tag team. Hayes was the mouth, the strutter, the man who could talk a crowd into a frenzy with nothing but a microphone and attitude. Garvin was the smoother operator, the pretty boy with just enough edge to make the act feel dangerous. Where Hayes was loud and brash, Garvin was slick and calculated. Together, they were the perfect combination of flash and substance, and they backed it up in the ring against some of the best teams in the world. They feuded with the Midnight Express, the Steiner Brothers, the Rock and Roll Express, Doom, and basically every top tag team WCW had to offer. One of their most notable title changes was at WrestleWar 91, where they defeated Doom to capture the WCW World Tag Team Championships. The match ended when Butch Reed accidentally struck his own partner Ron Simmons with a foreign object, and Big Daddy Dink shoved Garvin onto Simmons for the pin. It was classic Freebird opportunism. The interesting footnote is that the Freebirds actually lost those same titles to the Steiner brothers 6 days before they won them at WrestleWar, making their reign technically start in the negatives. It is one of the strangest championship lineage quirks in WCW history. Their WCW run was decorated with titles: 2 reigns as WCW World Tag Team Champions, 2 reigns as United States Tag Team Champions, 1 run with the WCW World 6-Man Tag Team Championship alongside a masked partner known as Bad Street, who was Brad Armstrong under a hood. They also brought in a rotating cast of managers and associates over the years, including Little Richard Marley, Big Daddy Dink, and a young Diamond Dallas Page, who served as their manager in early 1991 before going on to become one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. By the summer of 1991, the act was running on fumes. Bad Street was gone, their managers had departed, and the Freebirds had no clear direction. They briefly brought Precious back as their manager, but she only made 1 appearance at WrestleWar 92. The writing was on the wall. When Bill Watts took over as Executive Vice President of WCW, a wave of budget cuts followed, and the Freebirds were among those targeted. After losing the United States Tag Team titles to Dick Slater and the Barbarian, Garvin was split from Hayes. He worked some singles matches against the Barbarian and teamed briefly with Tom Zenk before his final match with the company in October 1992. After leaving WCW, Garvin got a tryout with the World Wrestling Federation. He filmed an unaired interview segment with Gene Okerlund at a television taping in Springfield, Illinois, where he insulted the Ultimate Maniacs and predicted heel victories at the Survivor Series in 1992. But Garvin never signed with the company. Interestingly, his voice from that unaired segment, along with Okerlund's, was later sampled into the title track of the WrestleMania album. So technically, Jimmy Garvin is on a World Wrestling Federation album despite never actually working for the promotion. Garvin used his time away from the ring productively. He started training to become a commercial airline pilot, a pursuit that would eventually define his post-wrestling life. But the ring was not quite done calling. In February 1994, he made a one-off appearance at Super Brawl 4, replacing the injured Michael Hayes in a losing effort against Johnny B. Bad. Then he headed to the Global Wrestling Federation, where he reformed the Freebirds one last time with Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes. It was a reunion that felt both nostalgic and bittersweet. The Global Wrestling Federation was a small Dallas-based promotion trying to fill the void left by World Class. And while it had some talented performers, it never captured the same magic. Garvin and Gordy won the Global Wrestling Federation Tag Team Championship in June 1994, defeating John Hawk and Black Bart. They were the final champions in the promotion's history, as the Global Wrestling Federation folded in September 1994. There was a planned feud with Chris Adams over the Global Wrestling Federation North American Heavyweight Championship, which would have been a wonderful callback to their classic world-class rivalry from a decade earlier. The two men who had torn the house down in Dallas arenas throughout 1983 and 1984 were about to do it all over again. But the promotion closed its doors before that angle could play out, and the wrestling world missed out on what could have been a special swan song for both men. After the Global Wrestling Federation, Garvin worked a handful of independent dates. He beat Greg Valentine for the ACW heavyweight title in November 1995. He lost to the Ultimate Warrior at an independent show in West Virginia in February 1996. In 1999, he even reunited with his stepfather Ron Garvin in Montreal, teaming with Michel Dubois against the Rougeau family. The Garvins won the Johnny Rougeau tag team titles in December 1999, and Jimmy's last match came on August 2, 2000, when they dropped those titles back to the Rougeaus. And then that was it. Jimmy Garvin was done. Unlike so many of his peers, Garvin walked away cleanly. He did not chase one more moment of glory. He did not show up on the independent scene year after year trying to recapture something that was gone. He retired at 40 years old, and he stayed retired. He got his airline transport pilot license and went to work for NetJets, flying private jets for a living. He married Patty in 1972. They had 2 daughters together, and they stayed married through all of it. The valet drama on television was just that, television. In real life, Jimmy and Patty Williams built a lasting partnership that survived the chaos of the wrestling business. The couple also became involved in ministry work, serving the poor and homeless in their community. It was a far cry from the glittering, arrogant, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin who strutted his way through arenas across the country. But maybe that contrast is what makes the story so compelling. The man who played a character obsessed with his own beauty and vanity turned out to be someone whose real-life priorities were family, faith, and service to others. The wrestling persona was just that, a persona. The real James Williams was always someone else entirely. Garvin also briefly returned to the wrestling world in an unexpected way. In October 2006, he joined the World Wrestling Entertainment creative team. He lasted 5 days before quitting because he found the job too stressful. It is a hilarious footnote that a man who spent decades getting hit with chairs, locked in steel cages, and having cement blocks smashed over his legs, decided that writing a wrestling show was more demanding than being in one. On April 2, 2016, the story came full circle. Jimmy Garvin was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as part of the Fabulous Freebirds, alongside Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts. Gordy and Roberts had both passed away by that point, making the ceremony bittersweet. But it was official recognition of what the wrestling world had always known. The Freebirds were legends, pioneers who helped popularize entrance music and created the Freebird rule that teams still use to this day. And Jimmy Garvin was one of them, not a hanger-on, not an afterthought. A legitimate member of one of the most influential factions in wrestling history. Looking back on his career, what stands out about Jimmy Garvin is not just any single match or title reign, it is the versatility. He could be the most hateable villain in the building, preening and hiding behind sunshine while Dallas crowds wanted his head on a platter. He could be the sympathetic babyface fighting Ric Flair for his wife's honor while grown adults wept in the stands. He could be the cocky tag team specialist strutting to Bad Street USA with Michael Hayes. And when the time came, he could be the guy who put the boots away and never looked back. Wrestlers who burn hot in the 80s and walk away clean are rare. Wrestlers who transition into stable second careers are even rarer. And wrestlers who manage to keep their marriages, their health, and their dignity intact after decades in this business, well, you can count those on one hand. Jimmy Garvin was never the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was never the top guy in any promotion he worked for. But he was something that matters more in the long run. He was a performer who understood his role, played it brilliantly, created moments that fans still talk about decades later, and then walked away on his own terms. He never overstayed his welcome. He never became a parody of himself. He never ended up on some sad reality show trading on past glories. He just left. Think about his contemporaries for a moment. So many of the wrestlers who worked alongside Garvin in the 80s and early 90s met tragic ends. David Von Erich, Kerry Von Erich, Mike Von Erich, Terry Gordy, Buddy Roberts, Chris Adams. The list goes on and on. The wrestling business of that era was brutal, in ways that extended far beyond the ring. Substance abuse, financial ruin, broken relationships, early deaths. These were not exceptions. They were practically the norm. Jimmy Garvin managed to avoid all of it. In a business that chews people up and spits them out, Jimmy Garvin beat the odds. He got in, he gave everything he had, and he got out. And that might be the most gorgeous thing about him. Like and subscribe for more wrestling documentaries from the Territory days. Until next time.